Okay, we were in the process of studying Apollos as being the author of this book. And we were giving some of the reasons as to why he probably was the author. And I'll go back and review the first three because we only gave three of them. And number one was that he was an Alexandrian Jew. And Alexandria was a learning center, had boasted of the largest library in the world, and Apollos was from there. So he had plenty of opportunity and the facilities to study. And the scriptures inform us in Acts 18 and verse 24 that he was very eloquent, so which lets us know he was a very good speaker. And he knew the Old Testament scriptures. And this is about 52 AD when he came to Ephesus, and Priscilla and Aquila heard him there, and he only knew the baptism of John. So they took him out privately and explained him the way of the Lord more perfectly. And of course, that lets us know that they taught him about the gospel of Christ, and how one becomes a Christian is through hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, and being baptized. And I don't think they baptized Apollos. I think if they had, they would have told us, or Luke would have told us. But what this leads me to believe is that Apollos was already baptized with John the Baptist. And but those people who were baptized by John's baptism before Acts 2 did not have to be rebaptized. And I think Apollos fell into that group, that he was probably a disciple of John, and therefore, when Priscilla and Aquila taught him the gospel more perfectly, there's nothing said about them baptizing him, because I don't think they did. He was being an educated person from Alexandria and being fluent in the scriptures. He knew the Old Testament very well, and he probably knew Greek very well. And whoever wrote this book of Hebrews wrote it in about the best Greek in all the New Testament. It's just superb. Much of it is classical, and it's in the way the sentences are composed and the way the logic flows, and some of the words used are unique to this book, and it's just a couple of steps above the other Greek in the New Testament. Now, that brings us down to where we got to, and the fourth reason I have is he was associated with the Apostle Paul quite a while in his ministry, and he was highly recommended by Paul to the brethren at Corinth. So Paul wanted him to go to Corinth and work there some, and we'll see that scripture later in connection with another thought. But he taught accurately the things concerning Jesus. Now, this is according to Acts 18 and verse 25. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, knowing only the baptism of John. Now, the name Jesus, as used here in Acts 18:25, is used more times in the book of Hebrews than any other New Testament epistle. And this epistle also is unquestionably a work that was written accurately. And we'll point some of this out as we go through the explanation of the text. the tenses of the verbs and the words chosen are so precise. Again and again, he uses the exact word to convey the meaning that needs to be conveyed there. Apollos was associated with Timothy, and it seems that he worked with Timothy on some occasions. Of course, this comes as a result of both Apollos and Timothy being associated with Paul. He held a very high reputation in the early church. Acts 18 shows that Luke was very impressed with Apollos. The Apostle Paul wanted him to return to Corinth to help there. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 12, which was written about 57. Paul says, "As touching our brother Apollos, I greatly desired him to come unto you with the brethren. But his will was not at all to come at this time. But he will come when he shall have convenient time." So this lets us know that the Apostle Paul wanted Apollos to go to Corinth and to work there with the brethren that he was sending, but Apollos just didn't want to go right then. We don't know why, but there was something else that he wanted to do, but Paul says he will come when he has convenient time. Now this is about 57 when Paul is writing this. So the reference in when Priscilla and Aquila took him out and taught him the way of the Lord more perfectly, that was in 52. So here we got 5 years later when Paul wanted Apollos to go to Corinth. So, if you're working in the gospel, you can do a lot in 5 years. And I think probably Apollos had done a lot in 5 years. And this is why the Apostle Paul wanted him to go to Corinth, because if you read the 1 Corinthian letter, you see how many problems there were at that church. And no doubt he wanted Apollos to go and try to help settle some of these problems. And another reason that Apollos may have written Hebrews is that he had the time and the opportunity to write it. He wasn't like Paul. Paul was so busy in fulfilling the plans that he made to go to Spain and all this, and he came back and then he was rearrested in Macedonia and took to Rome. And Paul just really didn't have much time to write this book, whereas Apollos had plenty of time. And this book was probably written about 68 A.D. Remember, Rome burned in 64. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. Well, we know Jerusalem was still standing when the book was written. And we'll point out these scriptures when we get there, but we see that some of the references are made that the law was ready to vanish away. It hadn't vanished away yet. It was ready to vanish away, which lets us know that the Jerusalem had not been destroyed. The temple hadn't been destroyed. The altar, the priesthood, and all this had not yet been destroyed when this book was written. So it was written probably about 68. And we'll see some more evidence as we go through the verse-by-verse study of the book as to why Apollos may have been the author. So any comment before we leave that?
It's a little bit confusing as to why Apollos was out there preaching, and preaching so eloquently, but he did not know anything about the baptism of Jesus.
Well,
because nobody had taught him?
Evidently he had not heard the gospel after Acts 2. He was like the apostles up to Acts 2. And that's what he knew, is he knew the gospel. Jesus preached the gospel.
Yes.
But he didn't preach it in fact. In fact means the the death, burial, and resurrection hadn't happened yet, so he couldn't preach it in fact. But he preached the gospel in preparation that he did preach that he was going to die and that he would be raised again. But he couldn't preach the gospel in fact. And he certainly couldn't preach baptism, New Testament baptism, what we call New Testament baptism. And I think Apollos was in that particular group of people that just had not heard the gospel after Acts 2. That's why I think he was a disciple of John, like the other disciples were. And there was about 120 of them there mentioned in Acts 1 and verse 20, where the brethren were gathered together. And all of them were disciples, but they had been baptized with John's baptism, and I don't think any of them were baptized with baptism of Acts 2:38 because they didn't need to be. They were like the apostles. They were grandfathered in. The only people that have to be baptized with the baptism of Acts 2:38 are those people who were becoming followers of Christ after Acts 2. If they were followers of Christ before Acts 2, they were okay.
Well, now, they did take a group that had been known only the baptism of John and rebaptize them. Some of the apostles did it.
I don't guess I understood your comment.
There was a group of people that had known only the baptism of John, and they didn't know about the Holy Spirit, and some of the apostles took
Yeah,
and
there
rebaptized.
was 12 people that Paul found at Ephesus, yeah. And he baptized them. But the reason is that they became disciples of Christ after Acts 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And once a person becomes a disciple of Christ after Acts 2, which includes everybody today, they've got to be baptized with Acts 2:38 baptism. Very good. Anything else? Okay, let's look at the text then. We'll go to verse 1. Do what?
I need to fix that table before it collapses and your computer might fall.
That would not have been good. She just happened to notice it.
That's your angel.
Okay. Hebrews 1:1, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. The writer here, whoever he is, starts out by making the great contrast here in this book that he presents to us. The theme of this book is that Christianity is better than Judaism. That's the theme of it. To develop this theme, this writer has chosen to present contrast between what God has done in the past with what he does today. And that's what Hebrews is all about. It's this contrast between what God did in the past and what he has done today. And he's going to show that what he has done today is so much better than what he did in the past. So why would these Hebrew Christians even think about leaving something better to go to something that's not as good? And this is going to be his argument here. So the first contrast here is between how God spoke to his people in the past and how he speaks to us today. Now, the writer doesn't waste any time with a salutation or an introduction. He jumps just right into the important thing he wants to present to these brethren that's going to bolster his purpose for writing. In the past, he says, God spoke at many different times and in many different ways. But now, but not in any of those times and ways did he ever tell everything the people needed to know. It was in bits and pieces. Bits and pieces. Now you contrast the many times and the many ways that he spoke to the fathers by the prophets with how he speaks to us today. And that's what the writer is going to get to. He spoke to them with the prophets. How's he speaking to us? Through his Son. And you already see the contrast between the prophets, plural, and the Son, singular. It's just this immeasurable contrast. So much of a contrast you can't even measure. Well, in those many different times and ways that God spoke to them, none of them ever got the whole story. They just got a part of it. They got enough of it to excite them and to cause them to want to hear more. But God helped that. He veiled many of the things he said so that they really couldn't understand it. But they knew something better was coming, but they just didn't know what it was. But it excited them and it caused them to want to hear more. And this is why when the Messiah finally came, everybody was looking for him because their hearts were yearning for that. Did you remember the woman at the well? We know that Messiah cometh, and when he cometh, he's going to tell us what? All things. He's going to tell us everything. You can imagine now how excited these people were. That's why when she run into town and says, I found a man that told me everything I did. Could this be the Messiah? And what did the people in town do? Yeah, they come out to see him. They were all waiting for this, and they wanted to see him. So we see how this goes into God making the time right to bring his Son into the world. Now, we learn from this that a prophet is one who speaks for another. If you remember, when God called Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let my people go, what did Moses start doing?
Making excuses not to
Yeah,
go.
he's making excuses. Why? He didn't want to go. Why?
Scared.
He says, I can't talk. I'm not a good speaker. God said, here comes Aaron, your brother. I know he's a good speaker. And he says in Exodus 4 and verse 16, and he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. So what is a prophet?
One sent.
Yeah, he's a mouth, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's a mouth. He speaks for
Spokesperson.
somebody. Whoever sends him, he speaks for him. He's his prophet. Aaron was Moses' mouth. And so in Exodus 7 and verse 1, God says, the Lord said unto Moses, see, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. So a prophet is someone who speaks for another. What he says is not from his own source, it's from whoever he's speaking for. And that's who a prophet is. On one occasion, God spoke to Balaam through his donkey, didn't he? His donkey was a prophet to Balaam because the donkey spoke to Balaam. And on God's behalf, Numbers 22, verses 27 through 30. The Lord opened the mouth of the ass, and she said to Balaam, what have I done unto thee that thou hast smitten me these 3 times? And Balaam said unto the ass, because thou hast mocked me, I would there were a sword in my hand, for I would kill thee. Can you imagine Balaam talking back to his donkey? He was kind of upset, wasn't he? Oh, man. But we see that that's what the word prophet means. So Jesus Christ, we learn, is God's prophet to us today. And you know, when Jesus came to this earth, he always made it plain and clear that the words he spoke were whose words?
The Father.
His Father's words. They're not mine, he says. They are his who sent me. And of course, God sent him. And so he always spoke his Father's words. Any comment on verse 1? Okay, look at verse 2. Hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. Now, there are 3 main verbs in this verse. A verb is the part of speech that shows action. The first of these verbs is what God has done for us in these last days. What he has done for us in these last days is that he has spoken unto us by his Son. Now, these last days tells us that this is the final dispensation that God is going to deal with man on earth. There have been 3 dispensations. What are they? Patriarchal dispensation, Mosaic,
and the Christian.
and now the Christian. And the Christian is the last one, because it's said even in the Old Testament, in prophesying of this, in Joel 2, the days will come in the last days when I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. And in Isaiah 2, that in the last days, God's going to establish his house in Zion. And the word of the Lord will go forth from Zion, and all people will go up to his house, the house of the mountain of the Lord. And so here is these last days. The last days always refers to the Christian dispensation. So, in these last days, how does God speak to us?
Through his Son.
Through his Son. Now, this excludes everybody else. It excludes Martin Luther, it excludes the Pope, it excludes everybody else. It's what the Son says that matters. That's what the way God speaks to us today.
Well, is it through his Son, through his Son, through the Word, his Word?
Well, that's his Son. Yeah, the Word. And we're going to find out a little bit later that it's God speaking too, because God speaks through his Word. All right, that's the first verb. How God has spoken unto us. Now, there are 2 others. Whom he hath appointed heir of all things, and by whom he made the world. So these 2 verbs begin a description telling us who this Son is. First, he's the heir of all things by God's own appointment. Now, what is an heir?
Someone who inherits.
He's somebody's going to inherit something. Now, God appointed his Son heir of what?
All things.
All things. What does that leave out? There's nothing left out. He's going to get it all. He's going to get all of it. Not just a part of it, not most of it, but all of it. By God's appointment. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but right now, we just need to get it in our mind that this Son is not just God's spokesman, He's the heir of all things by God's appointment. In other words, He is the heir as son, as a son. He couldn't be an heir if he weren't a son. It's because He is God's Son that He's an heir. He fulfills that role to be God's Son. He's an heir. So it's as His Son, He is made heir of all things. What if Christ had refused to be born into this world?
He would have been
He wouldn't inherit all things.
disinherited.
He wouldn't be an heir. Now, since He's going to inherit all things, if anybody else is going to inherit some of these things, by what must happen for someone else to inherit some of these things?
Adoption.
Huh?
Adoption.
Yeah. The heir, who's going to get them all, has got to share it with it because they're his. They're his. And there's no one else there's nothing else that anybody can have unless He wills it that they can have some of it. You see. And so this is what's happening here. Now this heir that's going to, as the Son, is appointed by God to inherit all things. God's given them to His Son. Now His Son has got control of them. What can He do with them?
Keep it all.
He could keep it.
But He can share.
He could share it.
He shares it with us.
It's His. If He couldn't do, it wouldn't be His, would it? But it's His. And we're going to see that. This is going to play a major part in this letter here, the way the writer develops this. So first, He's the heir of all things by God's appointment. And then second, God used this Son to create all things. John informs us that all things were made by the Word. In John 1 through 3, John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made." And if we were to go back to Genesis 1 and go through there, we find that God said, 10 times God said. And when He said, what happened?
It happened.
It happened. Whatever He said happened. What do you say when you say something? You say words, don't you? You say words. Can you separate a word from its meaning? If you were to separate the word from its meaning, what?
Change the word.
Yeah, it's gobbledygook, isn't it? It's not a word. That word is a symbol of whatever it means. It means that. And words have meaning, and it's up to us to learn what those words mean. If we don't learn what it means, there's no communication that takes place. Daqui for best in Limbo Mina, Chance Ledge, New Intelligence, Pensacola New Intelligence, Limbo Mina. Now those are words. And if there were a Romanian here that knew Romanian, they would know what I said. But to you, it's gobbledygook. I mean, there's no meaning. But they're words, but there's no meaning. Now, Jesus Christ, when God spoke, he spoke a word, and by fiat of the power in that word, whatever it meant happened. And he brought these things into existence. So we see that the second verb in this is, or the third verb is, by him he made the worlds. He made, now the word worlds there translates the Greek word ionos, which means the eons. What is an eon? Eon, yeah, it's a vast span of time. It's an eon, by eon. God made the eons. Now, this word carries with it the idea that not only is it a long period of time, but everything that transpires during that time is included in eon. Eon is not just the time, but everything that transpires during that time. And the word is plural. He says he made the worlds. He made the eons. In other words, there are epochs of time. And those epochs of time, since the beginning of creation, not only was that time created, but this Christ, who created it, also is in charge of carrying out what happens during that time so that God's purpose for the time is reached. So this is what we call God's providence. God's providence brings about the purpose that he once brought about during that period of time. You remember when we studied the Revelation letter, from about 64 AD to 313, there were 10 documented persecutions against the church. But in 313, Constantine signed the Edict of Toleration, ending all of that. So God, in his providential care, brought about victory over the Roman Empire so that the church, rather than the church being destroyed, the Roman Empire was destroyed. The Roman Empire has been gone a long time. The church is still here. And as Daniel prophesied in Daniel 2, about verse 44-45, a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, smote the image in its feet, and pulverized all of those kingdoms, and the stone grew and filled the earth, and it's the kingdom that'll never be destroyed. So the church is that universal kingdom. It's the only universal kingdom this world will ever see again, is the church. And this is Christ, in creating the eons, is bringing this about. He's ruling in such a way that this is what happens. Okay. Any comment down through verse 2? My goodness. We out of time. Well, Lord willing, we'll pick up with verse 3 Sunday morning. Any final comment from anybody?
This is all very interesting. It's very interesting.
Okay, we'll stop there with verse 3 and pick up there Sunday morning, Lord's willing.